Think about the last time you said yes when every part of you wanted to say no. Maybe it was a favor you couldn't afford to give, but the person asking looked at you in a particular way, and the word yes came out of your mouth before you'd even made a decision. Maybe it was a plan you didn't want to join. A dinner, a weekend, a commitment that would cost you 3 times what you stood to gain. And you agreed anyway because the silence that would have followed your refusal felt more dangerous than the thing you were agreeing to. Maybe it was something smaller. An opinion you softened because you sensed that the honest version would create friction. A complaint you swallowed because the moment didn't feel safe enough to surface it. A boundary you failed to set because setting it would have meant watching someone be disappointed in you, and that, for reasons you didn't fully understand, felt like something you couldn't survive. Think about the last time someone made you feel guilty for something that, if you examined it honestly, wasn't your fault. They didn't accuse you directly. They didn't need to. They got quiet. They sighed. They said fine in a tone that meant anything but. And you spent the next 48 hours feeling a low-grade shame you couldn't entirely locate, apologizing in your head for something you couldn't quite name, rearranging your behavior to smooth over a disturbance that hadn't actually been yours to cause. Think about the last time someone pressured you into changing your mind, not by presenting better evidence, not by making a compelling argument, but simply by expressing displeasure, by withdrawing warmth, by making it clear in a dozen indirect ways that the version of you who disagreed was less welcome than the version who agreed. And think about how quickly you capitulated, how completely, and how, afterward, you told yourself it hadn't been that important anyway. Most people have been there. Most people live there in varying degrees, with varying intensity across most of their relationships. And yet when you ask them to describe the experience, many of them don't call it manipulation. They call it being considerate, being flexible, being a good friend, a good partner, a good employee, a good child. They call it caring about people's feelings. And in calling it that, they have given the most effective camouflage imaginable to one of the most pervasive psychological experiences of adult life. But then there are other people. You've probably met them. Maybe you've wondered about them. They seem to move through the same social situations as everyone else, the same pressures, the same guilt trips, the same emotionally charged dynamics, but something about them is different. When someone tries to guilt them, the guilt doesn't seem to land. When someone gets cold and withdrawn to punish them, they don't spiral into anxiety trying to restore the warmth. When someone pushes, they don't reflexively give way. They listen, they consider, and then they do what they were going to do anyway. They're not cold, they're not unfeeling, they're not oblivious or arrogant or secretly indifferent to others. In many cases, they are among the most emotionally perceptive people in the room. They notice everything. They understand what is happening. They simply don't respond to it the way other people do. And the question, the one that, once you start asking it, becomes almost impossible to stop, is why. Why do some people fold under social and emotional pressure while others seem almost impervious to it? Why does guilt devastate certain people while barely touching others? Why can a single disapproving silence send some people into weeks of anxious self-revision, while someone else registers the disapproval, finds it mildly interesting, and moves on? The easy answer, the one we reach for first, is that the people who can't be manipulated are simply tougher, stronger, less emotionally sensitive, better at not caring. But this answer, satisfying as it feels, is almost entirely wrong. Because when you spend time with genuinely unmanipulable people, not aggressive people, not emotionally defended people, but people who are simply free in the way that most of us are not, you discover something unexpected. They feel things deeply. Some of them feel things more deeply than anyone around them. The difference is not in the feeling. The difference is in what the feeling is allowed to decide. The people who cannot be manipulated are not harder than you. They are simply no longer waiting for your approval to make up their own mind. And understanding how they got there, understanding what shifts inside a person so that external pressure loses its leverage, is one of the most useful things a human being can explore. Not because it teaches you tactics, but because it reveals something about the architecture of your own psychology that most people spend their entire lives not seeing. So let's look at it. Slowly, precisely, without flinching. There is a woman who has spent the better part of 40 years being extraordinarily easy to manipulate. Not because she is weak or unintelligent, she is neither. But because she was raised in an environment where love and approval were connected. And somewhere in early childhood, she learned a rule that never got examined. The way to keep people is to give them what they want. The way to feel safe is to not disappoint. The way to be loved is to be agreeable. This rule was never stated aloud. It was absorbed, inhaled, the way children absorb everything important, not through instruction, but through the repeated, cumulative experience of what happens when you comply and what happens when you don't. She is now in her 40s. She has 3 relationships in which she regularly says yes to things she wants to say no to, regularly absorbs blame that isn't hers, regularly performs an emotional labor that is never acknowledged and never returned. She doesn't call these relationships manipulative. She calls them complicated. She calls the people difficult. She tells herself they need her. And every time she adjusts herself to preserve the peace in one of these relationships, the rule she learned as a child is reinforced. Give people what they want. Don't disappoint. Stay agreeable, and you will be safe. She will not be reading this. She doesn't search for content about manipulation because she doesn't think of herself as someone being manipulated. She thinks of herself as someone who cares about people. And caring in the way she has learned to perform it is indistinguishable from surrender. This is where the story of manipulation always begins. Not with the manipulator, with the wound that already exists, with the need that's already there, with the fear that has been operating quietly and efficiently long before any particular person learned to use it. Manipulation, at its core, is not primarily a strategy that one person applies to another. It is a strategy that only works when it finds purchase, when it reaches inside a person and finds something to grip. A fear, an old belief, an unhealed need for approval, a terror of conflict, a particular vulnerability that was created years ago in circumstances that have nothing to do with the present relationship, but which are now available to anyone who knows how, or simply happens, to press them. The manipulator is not always calculating. In fact, most manipulation does not happen in the cold, strategic, premeditated way we picture when we hear the word. Most manipulation is semi-conscious at best. Most people who manipulate do so because they've discovered, often accidentally, often in childhood, by pressing certain buttons in their own parents or siblings, that certain behaviors produce certain outcomes. That getting upset creates compliance. That withdrawing warmth creates anxiety in others, who then work to restore it. That expressing disappointment makes certain people immediately apologize and change course. They're not running a sophisticated psychological operation. They're using a set of tools that were effective once and have never been challenged since. But this doesn't make the impact any less real. And it doesn't change the fundamental truth. The manipulation only works because there's a wound available to activate. Let's talk about guilt, because guilt is the most widely deployed tool in the entire emotional manipulation arsenal. And the reason it works so effectively is not that it's particularly clever or that the people who use it are particularly skilled. It's that guilt is already inside most of us, waiting to be triggered, like a smoke alarm that goes off when there's no fire. A man in his mid-30s gets a phone call from his mother. She doesn't ask for anything directly. She doesn't make a demand. She simply tells him about her week, how quiet it has been, how she doesn't want to bother him, how she knows he's busy, how she just hopes he's taking care of himself. And by the end of this phone call, he has rearranged his Saturday, canceled a plan he'd been looking forward to, and committed to driving 3 hours to spend a weekend that will exhaust him. His mother didn't ask him to do any of this. The guilt she activated, the feeling that he was not giving enough, not being enough, that his comfort and his plans were a form of abandonment, did all the work itself. He will spend the drive home from that weekend oscillating between resentment and shame. Resentment because he didn't want to go. Shame because wanting not to go made him feel like a bad son. The guilt trip didn't require a command. It required only a vulnerability. His belief that his own needs are less important than other people's feelings. His belief that his care is measured in sacrifice. His belief that love means always being available. The guilt found those beliefs and used them like a key. Now consider someone else in that same phone call. Same mother, same tone, same implication. But this person has, at some point in their life, separated their love for their parent from their obligation to manage their parent's emotions. They feel the pull. They notice the implication. They even feel a pang of something, not quite guilt, but adjacent to it. And then they say, warmly, but without wavering, "I can't make it this weekend, Mom. Let's find a time in 2 weeks that works for both of us." And then they hang up and go back to their Saturday. The difference between these two people is not that one loves their mother more. The difference is that one of them has a boundary, not a wall, not a defense mechanism, not emotional coldness, but a simple, quiet internal line that says, your discomfort is not automatically my emergency. Your loneliness is not automatically my responsibility to solve by sacrificing my own needs. I can love you and still say no. These two things are not in conflict. That line, once drawn, makes guilt tripping almost entirely ineffective, because guilt tripping works by convincing you that you have failed in an obligation. And the person who has decided what their actual obligations are and what they are not cannot be convinced of a failure that didn't happen. The easiest people to manipulate are often the kindest. This is not a coincidence. Kindness, when it comes from a place of genuine generosity and strength, is almost impervious to manipulation. But kindness that comes from fear, from the need to be seen as good, from the inability to tolerate others' disappointment, from the terror of being disliked or perceived as selfish. That kind of kindness is a permanent invitation. The kind person who cannot say no is not kind because they have a generous heart. They are kind because they have been taught or have taught themselves that their value depends on their usefulness, that they are most deserving of love when they are most accommodating, that the approval of others is the currency their worth is measured in. And when you believe that, every request becomes a test of your adequacy. Saying no becomes a risk you cannot afford to take. And the people around you, whether they mean to or not, can spend the rest of your relationship spending the currency you've made yourself unable to stop handing out. There is a particular kind of dynamic that many people have experienced and almost no one names clearly: the friendship that operates entirely on guilt. You think of this person as a close friend, and in some ways, they are. The history is real. The moments of warmth were genuine. But you've noticed over time that the friendship seems to require a specific quality of your ongoing availability. When you're not available, they become injured. When you prioritize something else, they communicate, without saying it directly, that you have let them down. When you set a boundary, even a small one, even a gentle one, there is a period of cold withdrawal that lasts just long enough to register as punishment, then thaws just long enough to restore your relief and compliance. You stay in this friendship not because it consistently nourishes you. You stay because leaving it, even just gently reducing the weight of it, even just reclaiming a little of the energy it consumes, carries a cost you can't bring yourself to pay. The cost of their disappointment. The cost of being the person who pulled back. The cost of the story they might tell about you. The cost of appearing, to them, or to others, or to yourself, as selfish. And so you manage, you adjust. You keep showing up in ways that exhaust you because the alternative is more frightening than the exhaustion. And the friendship continues, and the dynamic continues, and somewhere in you, below the surface, a resentment grows that you don't allow yourself to acknowledge because acknowledging it would require you to look honestly at what is happening. This is manipulation without a manipulator, or rather, it's manipulation without malice. The other person may genuinely not know what they're doing. They may genuinely believe they just need a good friend. But the dynamic is still a trap, and the trap is still made of your own psychological material. Your belief that keeping people happy is your responsibility. Your fear of the narrative they'll construct if you disappoint them, your inability to let someone be upset with you without immediately working to undo it. Let's go deeper into that fear because it's worth examining carefully. The fear of being disliked is one of the most universally distributed fears in human psychology. It exists in almost every culture, in almost every personality type, at almost every level of maturity and emotional development. The desire to be positively regarded by others is not pathological. It is fundamentally human, woven into the social fabric of a species that survived by belonging to groups where exclusion meant death and approval meant safety. But somewhere in adult life, for most people, this ancient survival mechanism becomes decoupled from actual survival and attached to something much smaller: the comfort of any given interaction. The sense that every room you walk into contains a social judgment you can either pass or fail. The feeling that other people's opinions of you are data about who you are rather than simply observations about their perspective. And when you believe that, when you've made other people's approval into the mirror you use to see yourself, you have created the single most efficient manipulation vulnerability available. Because whoever controls your approval can, to a significant degree, control you. A person in a meeting has an observation that would genuinely improve the outcome of the conversation. They are reasonably confident in the observation, but they look around the room, read the social temperature, sense that the observation might be unwelcome to one or two people whose approval matters to them, and they swallow it. They say nothing. The meeting ends with a worse decision than it could have had, and the person sits with a familiar, diffuse dissatisfaction, not quite regret, not quite resentment, the feeling of someone who has not been fully present in their own life. No one forced them to stay silent. No one threatened them. No one even looked at them in a particular way. Their own fear of being received poorly was sufficient to silence them entirely. The manipulation didn't need a manipulator. The wound was so well trained that it operated on its own. This is the most sophisticated and most invisible form of control. The control you exercise over yourself on behalf of other people's possible reactions. The preemptive silencing. The self-censorship that happens not in response to actual pressure, but in anticipation of pressure that may never even come. Many people spend their entire lives this way, making smaller, safer, more accommodating choices in constant deference to an imaginary audience whose approval they never stop seeking and never quite receive. Now here is where the documentary turns. There is a particular kind of person who exists in almost every social ecosystem, family, workplace, friendship group, who has discovered through trial and error rather than deliberate strategy that certain emotional performances reliably produce certain outcomes. They learned early that crying generates attention, that anger generates compliance, that withdrawal generates pursuit, that making someone feel responsible for your unhappiness is often the fastest way to change their behavior. They didn't sit down one day and decide to be manipulative. They found what worked and they kept using it because it worked and because no one in their early environment made the cost of using it high enough to stop. These are not monsters. In many cases, they are people who never developed any other strategy for getting their needs met. People who were themselves managed and pressured and guilted in their own childhoods and who absorbed those methods as the normal grammar of close relationships. They genuinely may not understand why the person across from them is so distressed. They're just doing what everyone in their early life did. But understanding where a behavior comes from doesn't obligate you to receive it. There is a woman who has maintained a friendship for over a decade with someone whose moods function, in their social group, as a kind of weather system everyone navigates around. When she's happy, the group is light. When she's unhappy, which is often and loudly, everyone quietly reorganizes around her distress. She doesn't ask for this. She doesn't need to ask. The expectation was established so gradually across so many small incidents that it has calcified into a social norm. Her discomfort is a collective responsibility, and the women in the group, one by one, have learned to pre-adjust, to say the softer thing, to avoid the topic, to arrive already self-edited, to spend an unreasonable amount of mental energy before any gathering calculating how to be present without becoming a source of difficulty. This is the invisible tax of a group organized around one person's emotional volatility. And no one has named it, because naming it would be unkind, and because each individual act of accommodation is small enough to seem reasonable. It is only when you add them up that you see what the total cost is. Because we have been talking about the mechanics of manipulation from the inside, from the perspective of the wound, the fear, the need. We have been looking at what makes people vulnerable, and that is important. But it is only half of the investigation. The other half is this. What is different about the people who are not vulnerable in this way? What has shifted inside them? What do they have that others don't? Or more precisely, what have they stopped needing that others still do? And the answer, when you trace it carefully, is not what most people expect. You would expect the answer to be confidence, strength, psychological resilience, a thicker skin. But when you observe people who genuinely cannot be manipulated, not people who are simply defended or aggressive or emotionally shut down, but people who are truly free from external control, what you find is something quieter than any of those things. Something almost invisible. They have moved it from outside themselves, from the reactions and opinions and moods of other people, to inside themselves. They have, through some combination of experience and reflection, and sometimes painful, hard-won clarity, decided that their own perception of their own behavior is more trustworthy than the interpretation someone else is offering. This sounds simple. It is anything but, because the default human orientation is other-directed. We are wired to read social feedback and adjust accordingly. We are wired to treat the disapproval of others as meaningful data requiring a response. And for most people, breaking this automatic response, learning to sit with disapproval, to tolerate the discomfort of being misunderstood or disliked, to take in what others think without immediately having it reorganize who you are, is one of the most psychologically difficult things a person can do. A woman has been in a romantic relationship for almost 3 years. Her partner is not abusive in any way that a casual observer would name clearly. But he has a habit, when he disagrees with her, of becoming very quiet. The silence has a particular quality. It isn't peaceful, it's pressurized. It fills the room. It communicates without words that something is wrong, that she has been inadequate in some way, that the warmth between them is contingent on her changing course. And for the first 2.5 years of the relationship, this silence worked. Every time he went quiet, she would feel the anxiety rise, and she would talk faster, soften her position, offer reassurance, search his face for signs that she'd found the right tone. And eventually, the silence would lift, and the warmth would return. And the relief she felt in that moment was so profound that it masked temporarily the cost of the transaction. At some point, not in a dramatic epiphany, but gradually, in the way that real insights usually arrive, she began to notice the pattern, to name it, to realize that she was being trained as effectively as any psychological experiment to associate her own opinions with the punishment of his withdrawal and her compliance with the reward of his return. And she realized something that changed the dynamic entirely. His silence was information about him, not a verdict about her. The next time he went quiet, she didn't spiral. She noticed the silence, recognized what it was, let it sit there without rushing to fill it, and went back to reading her book. The silence lasted longer than it ever had before, because it wasn't working. And then it stopped. And then, gradually, the whole architecture of that particular manipulation crumbled, because the mechanism that powered it, her anxiety, her need to restore his approval, had been withdrawn. She didn't become cold. She didn't become aggressive. She didn't confront him with a psychological lecture about emotional manipulation. She simply stopped letting his silence be her emergency. And this is, in miniature, the entire story of how manipulation loses its power. Not through confrontation or defense or superior psychological tactics, but through the quiet withdrawal of the fuel it runs on. Manipulation runs on anxiety, on the need for approval, on the fear of conflict, the terror of disappointing people, the belief that other people's emotional states are your responsibility to manage. Remove those, or more precisely, decline to let them make decisions, and manipulation has nothing to grip. It doesn't disappear. The attempts don't stop, but they slide off, like water off something that no longer needs to absorb them. The people who are difficult to manipulate have, in one way or another, learned to distinguish between two very different things: other people's feelings and other people's demands. They take the first seriously. They register when someone is hurt or disappointed or angry. They feel it. They care about it. But they have stopped treating the second, the demand that you change your behavior to manage those feelings, as a debt you automatically owe. This distinction is subtle. It is also almost everything. There is a man who grew up in a household where his mother's moods were the weather everyone lived inside. When she was happy, the atmosphere was warm and light. When she was unhappy, and she was unhappy often, the entire house contracted. His father walked carefully, his siblings adapted, and he, as the eldest, became the specialist in reading her, managing her, finding the precise combination of attention and behavior that would restore the warmth. He was, by the time he was 10 years old, an expert emotional manager. He could tell from the sound of her footsteps on the stairs whether the day would be good or difficult. He could reroute a conversation mid-sentence to avoid a topic that would turn her. He spent a significant portion of his childhood keeping the peace he hadn't disturbed. He is now an adult, and he is still doing exactly this in every close relationship he has. He still reads people with extraordinary precision. He still adjusts in real time based on emotional signals. He still experiences other people's distress as his problem to solve. The skill that kept him safe as a child, the hypervigilance, the mood reading, the reflexive accommodation, has followed him into adulthood and installed itself as a permanent feature of his personality. And the people in his life, without knowing what they're benefiting from, have access to a person who will always, given the right pressure, find a way to give them what they want. He doesn't call this trauma. He calls it being considerate. He calls it being emotionally intelligent. He has no idea that the emotional intelligence he's so proud of was not developed freely, but was built under duress, as a survival mechanism in an environment that required it. He doesn't know that the same skill that helps him read people accurately is also the skill that makes him almost impossible to disappoint. And this is what makes the unmanipulable person's psychology so significant. Not because they are superior, not because they escaped something and now look down from a safe distance, but because what they have figured out or been forced by experience to discover is something that most people never clearly see. that the obligation to manage other people's emotional states was never actually theirs to carry. Let's talk about boundaries, because the word has been so thoroughly absorbed by popular psychology that it has almost lost its meaning. People talk about boundaries as if they are statements you make, walls you construct, lines you announce in clear and direct language. And sometimes they are those things. But the most effective boundaries are not announced. They are simply enacted. They are not drawn in dramatic conversations. They are expressed through the quiet, consistent refusal to do things that violate your own sense of what is right and what you can give. The strongest boundaries are usually the quietest. A woman at a family dinner is asked, for the third year in a row, the same question about her personal life that she has found painful and intrusive every other time it's been asked. She does not launch into an explanation of why she finds the question difficult. She does not deliver a speech about emotional boundaries. She does not get angry or visibly hurt. She simply says in a tone that is warm and entirely unchanged, "I'm not going to talk about that. How is the thing you've been working on coming along?" She redirects. She continues eating. She does not apologize for the redirect. She does not monitor the other person's reaction to see if they're offended. She has said what she needed to say, and she has moved on. The person asking the intrusive question is briefly disoriented because they were expecting a response that they could probe or push against. What they got instead was a closed door, not a slam door, a quietly, firmly closed one. This is what a boundary actually looks like in practice. Not dramatic, not confrontational, not requiring the other person's agreement or understanding. Simply a refusal, delivered without hostility, without over-explanation, and without the anxious monitoring that usually follows it. And here is the crucial thing. The other person may still be offended. They may still go cold. They may still withdraw. They may still tell a story about you that isn't flattering. And the person who cannot be manipulated hears all of this, or imagines it, or knows it might be coming, and still doesn't change course. Not because they don't care about the relationship, but because they have decided, somewhere deep and private, that their willingness to absorb discomfort is more durable than their willingness to violate their own sense of what's right. This is what self-trust looks like. Not confidence in the showy, declarative sense. Something quieter. A simple private faith in your own perception of a situation. A belief that your discomfort when a line is crossed is valid information, not overreaction. A willingness to act on what you perceive rather than waiting for external confirmation that your perception is correct. Most people have been systematically undermined in this capacity since childhood. And understanding how that happens and why it matters so much requires going into something that rarely gets named directly. In any environment where approval is conditional, where love is given generously when you comply and withdrawn when you don't, where you learn that the safest version of yourself is the most agreeable one, a specific psychological injury occurs. Not a dramatic injury, a quiet one. The injury is to your trust in your own perception. Over time, in an environment where your instincts and your preferences are regularly overridden, where you learn that your internal reading of a situation is less important than whatever interpretation the authority figure prefers, you learn to doubt yourself. You learn to check your perceptions against external approval before you trust them. You learn that the internal signal, the feeling that something is wrong, the sense that you want something different, The quiet conviction that a line is being crossed is not reliable until someone else confirms it. And when you have learned not to trust your own perception, you have created a vacancy where your internal authority should be. And into that vacancy, other people will pour. Not always maliciously, not always even consciously. But the person who has stopped trusting themselves creates a magnetic invitation for others to become the authority they stopped being for themselves. This is why gaslighting is so devastating when it works. Gaslighting, the process of systematically undermining someone's trust in their own perception, doesn't create the vulnerability it exploits. It finds a vulnerability that's already there. The person who already doubts themselves, who already looks to others for confirmation that their experience is real, who already has a history of being told that their feelings are overreactions and their instincts are unreliable. That person is already primed. The gaslighter simply performs, in a more deliberate and concentrated form, something that has probably been happening to that person in subtler ways for years. And conversely, the reason gaslighting finds no purchase in a psychologically settled person is not that they are somehow immune to self-doubt. They have self-doubt. What they also have is a sufficiently robust relationship with their own perception that when someone tells them their experience isn't real, there's enough internal evidence on the other side to hold. The ground doesn't completely give way. They can say, not necessarily aloud, but internally, "This is what I experienced. I know what I experienced. The fact that you're telling me I'm wrong doesn't automatically make it true." That internal steadiness is not arrogance. It is not the refusal to take in new information. It is simply the refusal to grant any individual person's version of reality automatic override power over your own. Let's sit with something uncomfortable for a moment. Most of the time, when we talk about manipulation, we frame it as something that happens to good people because of bad people. The villain is the manipulator. The victim is the person being manipulated. And while this framing is not wrong, some manipulation is cold and deliberate and genuinely predatory. It is incomplete. And the incompleteness prevents people from actually escaping the dynamic because it locates all of the power outside of them in the hands of the person doing the manipulating. But here is what is actually true. For most manipulation to continue across time, the person being manipulated must, in some sense, participate. This is not the same as saying they deserve it. This is not blame. This is simply observation. The dynamic requires two components to sustain itself. It requires someone to push, and it requires something in the other person to give way. And while you cannot always control the pushing, you can not easily, not instantly, but genuinely and over time, change what is available to give way. The people who find their way out of persistent manipulation don't usually do it by confronting the manipulator. They do it by removing the available vulnerabilities one by one. They do it by getting honest about the fears that are being exploited. The fear of conflict, the fear of abandonment, the need to be liked, the inability to let someone be angry with them, and then doing the slow, uncomfortable work of letting those fears be present without letting them steer. A young woman has a colleague at work who has, over the course of 2 years, mastered the art of making her feel responsible for his failures. Not through direct accusation, he is too subtle for that, but through implication, through the careful deployment of shared history, I thought we were a team. Through mild expressions of injury. I just didn't expect you to do it that way. Through the social pressure of mutual connections. I mentioned to the others that you and I might be having some tension. None of these are clear violations. None of them are the kind of thing you can easily report or even describe without sounding hypersensitive. But each one is designed to produce a specific outcome. Her guilt, her anxiety, her desire to smooth things over, and ultimately her continued willingness to cover for his inadequacies. One day, after a conversation that left her sitting in a bathroom stall for 10 minutes, trying to understand why she felt so much worse after talking to someone who had said nothing directly unkind. She names it. Not to him, to herself. She names the dynamic. She names the way the implication works. She names the specific fears he exploits. And then, the next time he deploys the look or the implication or the mild injury, she notices it. She names it internally, and she says, with genuine warmth and zero compliance, "I'm sorry you felt that way. I made the decision I thought was right." And she moves on. The first few times, her hands shook a little. The anxiety was still there. The fear that she'd created an enemy, the discomfort of not smoothing it over, the old training pulling her back toward accommodation. But she let the anxiety be there and continued anyway. And gradually, over the following weeks, she noticed something. He stopped. Not immediately, not without some escalation first, but once the guilt stopped working, once the implication produced discomfort rather than compliance, the tool became useless and he put it down. Manipulation ends the moment guilt stops working. Not when you explain the manipulation, not when you call it out, or name it, or deliver a careful account of how you've been feeling. Sometimes it ends after exactly that kind of conversation, but often the conversation is not the point. The change in what you do is the point. When the response to guilt stops being apology and accommodation and starts being acknowledgement without capitulation, the mechanism has no fuel. It may run for a while on inertia. It will eventually stop. Now, there is something important to say about the people who have done this work, who have genuinely, over time, moved their authority inward and stopped being vulnerable to the most common forms of emotional pressure. It is not a comfortable place to be, at least not at first. There is a cost to becoming unmanipulable that is rarely discussed, because the dominant narrative is that this kind of psychological freedom is purely a gain. But some people lose relationships when they stop being manipulable, because some relationships were built entirely on the premise of their accommodation. When they stop accommodating in the old way, when they start having needs they voice and limits they enforce, and opinions they don't immediately soften, some people leave. Some people get angry and stay angry. Some people tell stories about the change, that this person has become difficult, selfish, cold, different in a way that is framed as deterioration rather than growth. And the person has to let them leave, has to let the story be told, has to tolerate the discomfort of being the villain in a narrative they know is distorted, without feeling compelled to rush in and set the record straight. Because the need to correct other people's perception of you is just another form of the same approval seeking that made you vulnerable in the first place. The person who is truly free from manipulation is also free, or learning to be free, from the constant management of their own reputation. They have decided that how they behave is more within their control than how they are perceived, and they have made peace with the gap between the two. This is what emotional independence actually means. Not the absence of connection, not the absence of care. The care is still there, usually quite intense. It is simply no longer conditional, no longer leveraged, no longer subject to the anxiety of withdrawal and the relief of return. Let's look at something that doesn't get enough attention: the specific experience of growing up in an environment where your boundaries were not respected, and how that shapes the adult psychology you carry into every relationship you ever have. A child who says no and has that no consistently overridden by physical force, by emotional pressure, by the simple fact of being smaller and less powerful, doesn't just learn that this particular no didn't work. They learn something about the reliability of their own preferences as a guide for their interactions with the world. They learn that what they want is negotiable in a way that what others want is not. They learn that their emotional signals, their discomfort, their reluctance, their desire to stop, are not particularly important information. And they carry this learning forward into adulthood as a structural feature of how relationships work. This is why some adults find it genuinely confusing when they're told they have the right to say no. Not intellectually confusing, they understand the concept, but viscerally, emotionally confusing. Because no has never felt like a stable thing. It has always felt like the beginning of a negotiation they were going to lose, or a confrontation they were going to have to survive, or a disappointment they were going to have to manage. The word feels dangerous. Not metaphorically, physiologically. Their heart rate increases. Their mind begins immediately to construct the justification that might make the no acceptable. They are already apologizing for a refusal they haven't even delivered. The person who cannot be manipulated has usually found a way to make peace with the physiological experience of saying no, not by suppressing it, not by overriding it with sheer willpower, but by going through it enough times, by saying no and surviving the discomfort that follows, by watching the feared consequences either not materialize or materialize and turn out to be survivable. That the body eventually learns what the mind has been trying to teach it. The discomfort is not danger. It is just discomfort. There is a man who, for most of his adult life, has said yes to almost everything asked of him by the people in his immediate social and professional circle. Not because he particularly wanted to, but because the anxiety of saying no, the anticipation of their disappointment, the imagined withdrawal of their regard, the feared consequence of being seen as someone who doesn't show up, was reliably more aversive than whatever inconvenience the yes created. He has built his reputation on availability, on helpfulness, on the perception of generosity that is really, at its root, an inability to tolerate other people's displeasure. At 42, through a convergence of circumstances, a particularly exhausting 6 months, a conversation with a therapist who named the pattern clearly, a friendship that ended because he finally said no to something and discovered the friendship couldn't survive it. He begins, slowly and uncomfortably, to practice. To notice the yes forming before he's made a decision. To pause. To ask himself genuinely and privately whether this is something he wants to do or something he wants to want to do so that he can feel like a good person. To sit with the pause long enough to find the answer. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes to let the answer be no and say it and then watch what happens. What happens is usually not catastrophic. The feared withdrawal of affection often doesn't come. The imagined loss of regard often doesn't materialize. And in the cases where it does, where the person responds to his no with genuine cooling or withdrawal, he discovers something important. He survives it. The relationship may survive it, or it may not. But he survives it. And each time he survives it, the territory of what he can tolerate expands slightly. This is not a triumphant story of transformation. He still feels the pull of the old pattern. He still sometimes says yes when he means no, and then lives in the particular quiet resentment that follows. But the pattern no longer has the unconditional authority it once had. There is now a gap, small, sometimes very small, between the pressure and the response. And in that gap, something he didn't used to have, a choice. The gap between stimulus and response is where freedom lives. It is not a large gap for most people. It doesn't have to be. It just has to exist. The person who has reduced their vulnerability to manipulation hasn't eliminated their fears or their desires for connection or their natural responsiveness to social pressure. They have simply inserted enough of a pause between the activation of those feelings and the actions those feelings used to automatically produce that they can, not always, but genuinely and increasingly, decide what to do rather than simply react. This is internal authority, not a state you achieve once and maintain effortlessly. A practice, something you do repeatedly in the specific moments when the old pattern pulls, and something you sometimes do poorly and sometimes do well, and something that gets incrementally easier over time without ever becoming entirely easy. And the moments of doing it poorly matter too, because the person who is building this kind of freedom is not a person who never folds. They fold sometimes. They say yes when they mean no, still sometimes. They soften the opinion, still sometimes. They feel the familiar pull of someone's disappointment and find themselves apologizing for something they didn't do, still sometimes. The difference is that these moments are no longer invisible to them. They see them as they happen, or shortly after. They name them. They learn from them. They notice what specific fears were active, which specific wounds got pressed, and they carry that information forward. The person who cannot be manipulated is not someone for whom manipulation never tries. They are simply someone who has become an increasingly attentive observer of the moments when it tries, and who has decided that the observation itself, the naming itself, is more important than the shame that used to follow the giving way. Let's be honest about something else that rarely gets said. The people who are genuinely difficult to manipulate are also frequently difficult to have relationships with in the way that most relationships are structured, because most relationships, not all, but many, contain a degree of informal manipulation that everyone has agreed, without discussing it, to pretend isn't there. The mild pressure, the unspoken expectation, the slight inflation of emotion to get a desired response, the small silent treatments that calibrate behavior, the implication that your love is measured in your willingness to sacrifice. These microdynamics are so common that they often feel like love itself. They feel like the texture of close relationships, the normal give and take of people navigating each other's needs. And for many people, they are not experienced as manipulation at all, just as how being close to someone works. But when you're in a relationship with someone who has genuine internal authority, who notices these microdynamics, who declines to respond to the slight guilt inflation or the indirect pressure or the emotional leverage. The dynamic doesn't work. And this can feel, to the person who has always relied on these tools without naming them, like something has gone wrong, like the other person has become distant or unfeeling or unwilling to participate in what love requires. The need to be liked is one of the most expensive emotional habits a human being can have. The cost is enormous. It includes the favors you gave and resented giving, the opinions you didn't voice and then felt invisible for, the relationships you maintained past their expiration date because the cost of ending them felt higher than the cost of continuing them, the version of yourself you perform for audiences who would have preferred the real one if you'd ever offered it, the opportunities you didn't take because taking them might have unsettled someone whose approval you needed, the life that happened around the edges of the life you were managing. People who have genuinely reduced their need for external approval don't always feel freer in any obvious, immediate way. Often, they feel lonelier first, because the relationships they've been sustaining through accommodation thin out or end entirely, because the version of them that people were attached to, the accommodating, available, reflexively agreeable version, is no longer reliably present, because the social rewards for being easy to be around are significant, and stepping out of that role means giving them up. But underneath the loneliness, and eventually beyond it, there is something that is genuinely different, a kind of consistency in their interior life that approval-seeking never provides. Approval-seeking is inherently volatile. It goes up when people like you, and down when they don't, and it never touches the part of you that actually needs to be settled, because the approval of others is information about them, not about you. It tells you what they want, what they prefer, what makes them comfortable. It tells you almost nothing about your actual worth. There is a woman who spent the first 40 years of her life building her personality around being liked. She was extraordinarily good at it. She knew how to read a room, how to find what each person needed from her and provide it, how to be funny with the people who needed funny, and serious with the people who needed serious, and helpful with the people who needed helping. She moved through social situations with skill, and she was widely regarded as warm, generous, and easy to be around. She was also, privately, exhausted in a way she couldn't explain to anyone, because the person she presented never revealed enough of herself for anyone to understand what was actually happening inside her. She had maintained, across 4 decades of highly competent social performance, almost no relationships in which the whole of her, including the parts that were difficult, uncertain, sometimes wrong, had ever been visible. She was liked everywhere. She was known almost nowhere. When she finally, in the context of a friendship that was unusually safe, began allowing herself to be imperfect, to say the thing that might land wrong, to disagree openly, to admit to something she didn't know, to show up without having prepared the version, she discovered something that first terrified her and then slowly changed her. Some people withdrew. Some people seemed genuinely unsettled by a version of her that required something real in return. But a smaller number of people moved closer. They moved closer because the version she was now offering was more interesting, more textured, more actually present. She had spent 40 years making herself easy to be around. In doing so, She had made herself almost impossible to actually know. Internal authority is different, not because it's more comfortable. It is often less comfortable, especially at first, especially in the moments when you're sitting with someone's anger at you and not rushing to resolve it, but because it is yours. It cannot be withdrawn by someone who decides to stop being warm. It does not fluctuate based on how other people are feeling. It does not require renewal. It simply persists, quietly, as a foundation that remains stable even when the surface of your relational life is turbulent. This is the thing that manipulation cannot reach. Not because the manipulable person lacks it, they have it, or the seed of it, or the possibility of it, but because they have, for reasons that are entirely understandable and entirely worthy of compassion, been taught to ignore it, taught to look outward for confirmation that their inward experience gives them, taught that what other people say about them is more reliable than what they know about themselves. And in accepting that teaching, they have handed their authority to whoever happens to be holding the most social leverage at any given moment. There is a young man who has grown up in a home where love was expressed primarily through criticism. Not cruel criticism, careful, well-intentioned, genuinely affectionate in its way, but relentless. Every choice he made was assessed. Every preference he expressed was evaluated. Every version of himself he offered was returned with a suggestion for improvement. His parents loved him. He knew this clearly and still knows it. But the message, repeated across 2 decades, was unmistakable. Who you are right now is not quite enough. Who you are with some adjustments, those adjustments we will specify, will be more acceptable. He carried this into adulthood as the deepest possible conviction that his own judgment was not to be trusted, that the appropriate response to any decision was to look for external validation before committing to it, that his preferences, what he liked, what he wanted, how he saw the world, were drafts, to be revised in response to other people's reactions before they became anything real. He became, without intending to or knowing it, the perfect target for anyone who understood, consciously or not, that a person who doesn't trust their own judgment will accept yours instead. At some point, in his late 20s, through therapy, through several relationships that finally made the dynamic visible enough to name, he began the slow, uncomfortable process of building trust in his own perception. Not by deciding that his perception was always correct, not by dismissing others' input, but by deciding that his perception was a real starting point, that it deserved to be taken seriously, that the fact that someone disagreed with it was not, by itself, sufficient reason to abandon it. And that shift, quiet, internal, invisible to almost everyone around him, expressed only in small behavioral changes that accumulated over years, was the beginning of something that no particular manipulation tactic had ever provided. Not invulnerability, not imperviousness, not the absence of fear or the absence of the desire to be liked, just the simple, hard-won ability to hold his ground. Not because the ground was comfortable, but because it was his. We have spent most of this conversation inside the psychology of vulnerability, looking at the fears and the needs and the learned helplessness that make people available to be manipulated. And we have spent some time with the psychology of relative freedom, looking at what shifts when someone moves their seat of authority from outside to inside. But there is one more thing worth sitting with before we close. It is about what manipulation reveals. Every time someone attempts to manipulate you through guilt, through pressure, through the withdrawal of approval, through implication and social leverage and emotional leverage, they are, whatever else is happening, also telling you something. They are showing you what they believe about you. They believe that your behavior is available to be modified by their emotional state. They believe that your comfort and your values are negotiable given sufficient pressure. They believe that your need to be liked is stronger than your commitment to yourself. They are not always wrong. That is the uncomfortable part. But here is the thing about the people who have stopped being available in this way. They are not showing the world a harder exterior, and yet they are showing the world what they actually believe about themselves. They are demonstrating in their behavior the quiet conviction that they are not available for management, that their values are not on the negotiating table, that their discomfort with someone's disapproval is real and acknowledged, and also not sufficient reason to change course. That they can hold both things. I care about you, and I am not going to do what you're pressuring me to do, without one of them having to collapse. This is not toughness. It is something more precise and more durable than toughness. It is a settled sense of what you are and what you are not. A settled sense of what you owe and what you do not. A settled sense developed through experience and reflection and the slow accumulation of instances in which you trusted yourself and survived the consequences, that your own judgment is the most reliable authority you have access to. The people who cannot be manipulated are not people who feel less. They often feel more. They are not people who care less about others. They often care more deeply, with more genuine attentiveness, precisely because their care is not organized by anxiety. They are not people who have achieved some kind of emotional perfection or psychological arrival. They are simply people who have decided, sometimes deliberately, often painfully, always incompletely, that other people's reactions to who they are do not constitute a verdict. That disapproval is weather, not judgment. That guilt which hasn't been earned doesn't have to be carried. That the silence someone deploys to punish you is their silence in their relationship with their own emotional material and doesn't require you to solve it. That saying no to something you cannot give is not a failure of love. It is an act of honesty, which is a deeper and more sustainable form of love than performing a yes you do not mean. That the version of you that is most available to be loved is not the most accommodating version. It is the most honest one. And that the people who cannot tolerate your honesty, your limits, your no, your refusal to be managed, those people were not, whatever it felt like, loving you. They were managing you. And what they were managing was not you. It was their version of you. The edited, accommodating, fear-compliant version that you offered them because you were afraid that the real version would be returned. The real version is not more difficult to love. It is simply more difficult to control. And the people who have found their way to inhabiting that version fully, honestly, with all the discomfort and loneliness and occasional grief that comes with it, are not harder than you. They are not colder. They have not achieved something rare and unattainable. They have simply, at some point, in some ordinary moment that may not have felt significant at the time, decided to trust themselves more than they feared the reaction. That's it. That's the whole difference. Not strength, not imperviousness, not the absence of the fear that says, what if they don't like you for this? Just the quiet, difficult, genuinely available decision to let that fear be there, to feel it fully, to understand where it comes from, to treat it with the compassion you'd offer anyone carrying something that heavy, and then to do what you were going to do anyway. Because you decided your own perception of your own life is worth more than their permission. And you don't need their permission anymore. You may never have needed it,